if we look at this, the next graph just gives you sort of how no major party has changed by county over time, and you see that it's increased substantially in each county since 2000. And you can actually see, on the next one, if we look at it by year as opposed to by county, you can see that that's the only thing moving really there. That there's been a slight decline in the Democrats. So every time one of the parties declines, it's basically moving to independence. It's not shifting back to another party. So you see that this year there was a small Republican decline. There was actually, I think in 2004, Republicans went up by 1%, but they've gone, I think they went back down by 2 this time. Maybe it's only 1. Very close. If we look at change in partisanship by county, and this is just like a percentage, just to give you an idea how how this is working. In Santa Fe and Taos, partisanship is much higher than it was in 2004. It was the same in Bernalillo. It's about the same as it was in Bernalillo, Los Alamos, and Sandoval. Not much difference. But I counted every time there was a 2% change or more, because that's a lot of people. And you can see that for Democrats, they've actually lost voters in a majority of the counties, right? But think of it, most of the people live in Bernalillo, so you don't see that on the aggregated chart. But we are seeing sort of this sorting thing. So if you look at the next graph of Republicans and how their GOP partisanship has changed, you can actually see, and most of this took place between 2000 and 2004. The Republicans were really good in 2004 at bringing in new party registrants and getting people to change into their, I would say probably their correct party. So you can see that a lot of those southern counties, the Republican Party has increased quite a bit in terms of their overall numbers. I mean, so, they started out pretty small, so from a Ross Perot long ago chart thing, you can move up pretty fast if there's not very many of you. But I think that's, more importantly, there's a point there about the sorting that is going on in the parties, and that's something that's happening certainly nationally as well. And that is that it used to be that party was driven by state politics and local politics, of course by whatever your parents were. If your mom and dad happened to be of different parties, you're more likely to take your mom's partisanship. So, I guess that there's extra hours. Yeah. It's a probability. But I think that there's this thing going on where there's a lot of sorting going on. So people are recognizing and have been recognizing that the parties are more polarized. Right? We know that just intuitively at an elite level that the parties are more polarized. You can see that in terms of voting in Congress. You can see that in the positions that elites take. But that the electorate has also responded to that. And so what we've seen is that people who used to be Republicans now recognize, oh, maybe actually I'm a Democrat, and vice versa. People who identified themselves as Republicans have become, well, actually I'm a Democrat. And so you can see that sort of in the nationally as well, when you realize that sort of parties are taking on very regional pictures. So the Republican Party is really becoming the party of the South. And that's become more so and more so with each election. And the Democratic Party, I don't think there's any now senators in the Northeast that are Republican, right? And so that's part of this sorting that's going on. And that sorting that's going on at a much more micro level than just at a statewide activity. It's going on individually in households. We're finding that congressional districts are becoming tighter, that people are living in areas where they are more similar ideologically than they are different. And so this polarization of sort of the country where people recognize that, right, is also happening in New Mexico. And I think that's what we're seeing here, where we're seeing that this, sort of these southeastern counties, southern counties are recognizing their partisanship moving away a little bit from the Democratic Party. Again, we especially saw those numbers change in 2004, although they held steady into 2008 in those areas. So I think that sort of sorting, right, the sorting going on is sort of interesting, because at the same time people are sorting into the parties, that means that theoretically those parties are being pulled more ideologically in terms of their candidates, because now their members are also that way. And so we can think about what happened recently here in Albuquerque in the primary, where we had those legislative races where the progressive candidate actually beat the moderate Democrat. And part of what's going on there, again, is this recognition. So what we have is this underlying mixture of partisanship going on where people recognize their goals and their interests, and they're sorted correctly, and so they want to support those candidates. But then the problem is, well, how do you create a majority when your activist group is really pushing you to the left or pushing you to the right, but then there's this increase in independents who are actually going to decide the election? Right? So there's sort of this tension here. There's an interesting tension between like what's going on in the electorate in terms of the parties, and then what a candidate has to actually do to win a race, which tends to be towards, moving towards the middle, right? Especially in a big electorate. In a smaller electorate, you may get away with a sort of a different set of criteria there. But so there's this, and I think we're seeing this in New Mexico. So potentially, we could see more sort of fights in primaries, where the progressives are pulling the Democratic Party more to the left, equally so, and we certainly know this is the case in the Republican Party, which is smaller and therefore already ideologically tighter, right? That the Republicans are also doing that and have been doing it for quite a while, where their candidates are very conservative. I mean, certainly Pierce won over Wilson. Pierce was the more conservative candidate. Right? And so then that creates, again, this tension when you get to the general election, and where are these independents going to go to, which potentially creates that momentum for swings in electorates, as the candidates may be representing their voters, but they're not representing all of the voters, or even the voters that are going to decide the election. And so then those voters have to make a decision with the candidates more pulled out from the center than towards the center. And so that creates a more complex political environment. So that's sort of, that's sort of what I was trying to structure, this sort of interesting tension. And I think this model, we're seeing it, and I can't look at micro level data yet because I don't have any of that data. I can only look at the counties. But I think there's this very interesting pattern that we're seeing at the national level also happening in New Mexico, and I think that says something about our future elections. And I know everyone wants to think about this as like a realignment, right? There's this potential for a realigning election, but this would suggest otherwise. This would suggest that there's this potential for large swings as we move forward, that we can't necessarily look at this as so much as perhaps a mandate, right, as a response to a particular set of conditions. And I went back and I looked at the, in terms of a national election, I looked, and Roosevelt in 1932, he had 57% nationwide. That's pretty big compared to what we're seeing. But we had 57% statewide, and pretty impressive. I mean, certainly our legislature is more blue, and of course we all know that it's more liberal because we've had more progressives who are joining the legislature. So, those have consequences certainly to outcomes in terms of policy. The question is, how is the electorate then going to respond to those changes in policies? Are they going to be, in line with them, or are they going to reject them? Because they're not really, and this comes back to a discussion over here that was started about ideology and whether or not we're really a right-centered nation, or we're a left-centered nation, or we're a, center-centered nation. But, certainly in terms of the electorate, more people say they're conservative than they say they're liberal, in terms of the broad electorate. People don't, I don't know if they just don't like the word, or for certainly more people. And that's why I think that's where I think people, in terms of an academic sense, that's why we think we're sort of a right-centered nation. Because if you look at a curve and say where most people put themselves, just slightly conservative in the average, in the aggregate, there are not many people who see themselves as extremely liberal or extremely conservative. In fact, there's a very small. It's a pretty nice bell curve, but there's much more weighted towards the conservative side.